Good evening, everyone. My talk tonight is based on the research that I did for my tavern book. It involves several years of searching old newspapers, documents, and putting many, many miles on my car, tracing down the buildings that were taverns. From the newspapers, I learned the names of the taverns, and from the inventories of tavern keepers' estates, I learned how taverns were furnished. That was all well and good, but what really helped me understand what tavern life was like were the words of the men and women who kept the journals and diaries of their travels. They tell us what it was like to stay in a tavern, and you'll hear their words tonight. A tavern was a house that was licensed to provide entertainment, which was food, drink, and lodging for man and beast. The beast in those days was the horse, the beast today be our car. Taverns played a major role in early American life, and as such, they were strictly regulated. A man who wished to keep a tavern, whether he owned it or rented it, had to petition the court for a license and procure the signatures of men of good standing in the area who attested to the man's fitness to keep a tavern. He needed to petition for a license yearly and pay a fee. This is Thomas Lockhart's 1757 petition. Lockhart wrote that your petitioner is conveniently situated in the town of Carlisle for keeping a house of public entertainment for travelers and others, and has provided a stock of liquors and other necessities for that purpose. Your petitioner humbly prays your worship, will be pleased to recommend him to his honor the governor in order to obtain a license. Thomas Lockhart was a stonemason by profession, and he, like many other people, took to tavern keeping even just for a few years to supplement their income. It's even possible that he built the house where he kept a tavern. Well, what did a tavern look like? Most of us, if we're old enough, can recognize a one-room schoolhouse, and we can recognize a church. But that's not true when it comes to taverns. Why? Because they were houses that were licensed to operate as taverns, and they came in all types. Many taverns, like the sign of the Red Lion in New Kingston, were stone. It's a little hard to see that now. The house, the old tavern is still standing at the end of New Kingston as you leave New Kingston on the Carlisle Pike, which I guess is now the bypass. Some taverns were brick, like the sign of the Rising Sun in Carlisle. It's located between Post Road and the Sheets. Many taverns were log, like the Frankenberger Tavern in Mechanicsburg. A tavern was identified by its sign, which hung from a freestanding post in the tavern yard, or it was attached to the building by a bracket that extended out from the front of the house. The names of taverns didn't vary greatly from area to area. Taverns named the sign of the Red Lion were very common. The eagle became a common sign after the American Revolution because the eagle was the symbol of our new nation. Taverns called the Rising Sun were very popular, and as you can see from these two signs, they were portrayed in many different ways. I think the sun on the top looks like it's on steroids, and the sun on the bottom looks a little befuddled. Like it's not sure if it wants to rise. And of course, you can probably guess the sign on the right is the sign of George Washington, and after the Revolution, you could find a tavern called the Sign of George Washington in just about every town. Taverns were also called by the name of the tavern keeper. When it came to choosing a sign for the restored tavern complex in Dillsburg, the group looked to the past for their inspiration and copied the image of a bottle and glasses, like this sign on Loomis's Inn from 1811. These colorfully painted signs of bluebells and green trees, of bears and bulls and horses and swans and unicorns and even mermaids, hung from town taverns and dotted the roadsides. Welcome sights for weary travelers and for local people who just wanted some company for the evening and a drink. Locations. If you look at the sign up there at the tavern, I think you can figure out what the tavern name was. The sign of the green tree, I'm guessing. Taverns were located on main roads, and they were usually 6 or 7 miles apart. On heavily traveled roads such as the Walnut Bottom, the Trindle Road, and the Carlisle Pike, they could be as little as 3 miles apart. Obviously, this did not apply in towns and some of the larger villages. There were different classes of accommodations then as now. Distinctions were made in the clientele that the taverns catered to. There were taverns that catered to drovers and wagoners. There were taverns that catered to what was called the better sort of traveler. When stage lines were established, taverns that were stage stands became the aristocrats of the highway. They were furnished more elegantly, and they provided more comfort than other taverns. Tavern keepers sought the patronage of stage lines because they received a substantial amount for boarding its driver, for feeding its animals, and they made money from the passengers because the stage fare did not include the cost of lodging and food and drink. Does anybody recognize this house tavern? The Walnut Bottom Road between Shippensburg and Carlisle was toll-free, and it was heavily traveled by drovers and wagoners, taking their herds and goods to the markets in Philadelphia. Wagner and drover tavern stands like this tavern at Silver Hill. And again, it stands on the hill just outside Centerville when you're approaching it from Shippensburg. When Michael Wise applied here for a tavern license in 1825, several of his neighbors described the tavern complex and stated the reasons why Michael should be granted a license. John Harper, a local surveyor, wrote, "From its situation on the road, it is well calculated for a tavern stand, particularly for wagoners, as there's a large and convenient yard with a pump of water near the center, and the ground having a gentle descent either way from the house renders it more easy for wagoners to start their teams in the morning." He said that there was also a wagon maker shop and a smith shop on the site, and more than a proportional share of the teams and travelers on the road could be accommodated in the house. I was lucky enough when I was doing the research for this to go in every old house. And this particular house I've never forgotten. It was lived in by some Mennonite farmers. It has a big, beautiful barn next to it. There are 8 fireplaces in the house, and every one has a different mantle. It's a lovely house. And in the basement was filled with glass jars of canned goods. Tobias Hendricks Tavern in East Pennsboro Township, and this tavern at Mount Rock, 7 miles west of Carlisle, were two of the county's earliest taverns. The Great Road, which was an ancient Indian path that later became the Chambersburg-Harrisburg Turnpike, and of course now, Route 11, the Rittner Highway. It ran right past the Mount Rock Tavern. You can see that in the photograph, and you can see the source of water. Water was really important for, and this was one of the few taverns that had, along the Great Road, that had a source of water. The Mount Rock Tavern was mentioned in numerous journals, and although Washington never slept here, his troops did when they went west to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. Town taverns, just like those in the countryside, also catered to different types of travelers. Drovers, wagoners, and people on foot were not welcomed at taverns that catered to stagecoach lines. But no matter who the clientele was, the heart of the tavern was the bar room. This is a painting of a bar room in an American tavern. It was painted in 1813 by John Krimmel. And you can see the bartender behind the bar. You can see a door. And hanging from the edge of the door, I'm sure, is a farmer's almanac. There are newspapers hung along the wall. You can see different kinds of seating. Not everything matches, like many restorations today, many historic taverns today. You've got a birdcage Windsor chair, a stool. You'll see over in the far corner a stool and a desk, which is probably where the tavern keeper kept his accounts. The man with the, I guess, saddle, I'm not sure what that is, thrown over his shoulders, bringing the newspapers. The bar was a closet or a cage type affair with a panel that was lowered when serving and pulled up and locked at night to keep everything, to prevent theft. The bar had shelves which held punch bowls, glasses, bottles of liquor, strainers, playing cards, etc., as well as a communal razor for shaving. The only surviving bar in Cumberland County was taken out of Walker's Tavern on the Carlisle Pike a few decades ago and installed in a private home. The home was recently reconfigured, and the bar was donated to the Cumberland County Historical Society, and it was the model for this, which is the bar in the restored tavern in Dillsburg. When Carlisle tavern keeper Arthur Buchanan died in 1760, an inventory of his estate was taken. Items in his bar, and when I say bar, I do mean bar, not bar room. Items in his bar were quart decanters, pint decanters, 2 Delft punch bowls, a china punch bowl, tumbler glasses and stand glasses, 30 bushels of malt, 50 gallons of whiskey, a barrel of cordial, a wine pipe, and a copper still were standing in the basement. Just a year later, Andrew McIntyre died in 1761. His tavern, the Sign of the Indian Queen, was at the corner of High and East Streets. He kept a supply of wine in the cellar, as well as empty hogsheads, pipes, barrels, and brass cocks. His records show that he purchased liquors and foodstuffs from local merchants, as well as those in Lancaster and Philadelphia. Loaf sugar, which was ordered in weights of 9 to 12 pounds, Madeira wine, gallons of West Indian rum, port, nutmeg, and snuff were just some of the things in his accounts with merchants. This is the bar room in the Mechanicsburg Frankenberger Tavern. The furnishings in a bar room usually consisted of several tables, some Windsor or rush-bottom chairs, and sometimes a bench or two. Many barrooms had a map or an image of George Washington on the wall, as well as a looking glass. The size and type of tavern can be surmised from its furnishings. The furnishings in the barroom of George Wise's Spread Eagle Tavern in Carlisle were pretty basic. 12 chairs, 3 pine tables, a stove, a looking glass, and some shovel and tongs. On the other hand, John Faust, another Carlisle tavern keeper, also made musical instruments, and as I said, many tavern keepers had more than one occupation. He kept the sign of the Globe Tavern near Dickinson College, just about where Mbosser Library is. He died in 1822, and the items in his barroom included a 10-plate stove and drum, 12 chairs, 2 settees, 4 tables, a looking glass, as well as an organized harpsichord and 3 fifes. It's not hard to imagine that he treated patrons occasionally to a bit of lively music while they drank. And drink they did. Prices for drinks in standardized measures were set by the court. The rates listed here were set by the court in York County in 1752. As you can see on this list, 1 pint of Madeira wine cost as much as a quart of sangria rum punch. West Indian rum cost more than New England rum, and a quart of beer or cider at 32 ounces was a lot cheaper than a 4-ounce Jill of whiskey. Rum was the most popular drink in America and formed the basis for many drinks such as Mimbo. I don't expect you to read this. Maybe some of you can. This is Robert Guthrie's tavern account from the 1760s. At the top of the page, you can see that he's drinking quite a bit of whiskey. But several years later, as you can see at the bottom, he's turned into a Mim drinker. Mim was short for Mimbo, and it was made with rum and loaf sugar, brown sugar, water, and the rinds and juice of lemons and limes. Notice the charge on the 3rd line from the bottom for a club. When a person shared a bowl of punch with several men, each man's account was charged for a club, which was his portion of the whole cost of the bowl. Men would pass the bowl around from mouth to mouth, each man drinking from the rim of the bowl, regardless of germs. Beer, cider, slings made with gin, water, and sugar, shrub, made from boiling rum and sugar, water, and various fruits, were some of the many drinks to be had in a tavern. As well as providing drink, tavern keepers were also required to provide food. And I think that looks pretty good. Breakfast. Most travelers rose before dawn and put several miles on the road before they ate breakfast. So when they did sit down to eat, they were hungry. Meats such as ham and bacon and beefsteaks, even chicken, might be served, as well as eggs and toast, waffles, buckwheat, cakes, all washed down with tea and coffee. A French botanist, F.A. Michaud, who was traveling through Cumberland County in the 1800s, said of tavern breakfasts, "They make use of very indifferent tea, and coffee still worse, with small slices of ham fried in the oven, which sometimes they add an egg to, and maybe a broiled chicken." This tavern at Moordale was known as the Stone Tavern and also as Cumberland Hall. It was the most elegant tavern on the Walnut Bottom Road and operated for almost 100 years. In 1807, Fortescue Cumming, an Irishman transplanted to Connecticut, was on a walking tour to visit some land that he had bought in the West. And he kept a journal, which he later published, and wrote about his meal at this tavern. I stopped and breakfasted at a large tavern 7 miles from Carlisle. I got coffee, bread and butter, eggs, and excellent honey in the comb. My landlord presented me with one of the largest and finest apples I had ever seen. It was the produce of his own orchard. He had the manners of a New Englandman, but I soon gathered from him that he was a native of that part of Pennsylvania and of English extraction. Foreign travelers and New Englanders always were taking jabs at Pennsylvanians in their travel journals. They acted like once they crossed the border into Pennsylvania, it was like going to Mars, truly. Dinner. Dinner was the term for lunch and was usually served between noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was the main meal of the day and consisted of meat or fowl, stew, potatoes, or rice and vegetables. Desserts such as gingerbread, bread puddings, and pies were often served. Supper was the lighter meal of the day, and although meat was eaten again, it was usually cold. Dining habits. Travelers' journals and books about travel and customs in America were published by many foreign travelers in the early 1800s, and their descriptions of American dining habits are not too flattering, but amusing. So I'm going to read some to you. Quote, travelers wait in common till the family go to meals, and they eat at fixed hours. There was no ordering at one's own convenience. Americans never spent more than 10 minutes at the table. And a meal at a tavern was more a schoolboy's scramble than a social repast. One must get to the table at the first stroke of the bell. It will be hard for you to imagine the voracity with which people, who are, after all, decent and well-dressed, can throw themselves on the food. In spite of its volume, it soon disappeared. Americans think it an honor to be the first to leave the table. Foreign travelers were also surprised that Americans of all social classes ate at the same table. They must have also been surprised at who they shared their beds with in some of the taverns. Well, that's a little dark. Sleeping arrangements. For most travelers, a bed in a tavern was preferable, no matter how crowded, to a night spent outdoors. Most tavern accommodations were communal. There were always several beds in the room where you slept. Depending on the size of a tavern, 2 to a bed, sharing a bed with the tavern keeper or his children, a bed on the floor of the bar room or in the garret were just some of the ways a night might be spent in a tavern. Privacy was not an expectation of 18th and 19th century travelers. Fortescue Cumming, our traveler who had that delicious breakfast on the Walnut Bottom Road, walked on to Shippensburg, where he put up at the Black Bear Tavern. This is obviously a slide from a little later when the Black Bear Tavern had upped its standing to being called the Black Bear Hotel. Anyway, Fortescue Cumming bathed and dressed his blistered feet, and after supper he wrote that he retired to a good bed, but without an upper sheet, and the wagoners staying at the tavern spread their blankets and bedrolls around the stove in the bar room where they spent the night. In 1810, Margaret Van Horn Dwight, a very proper lady from Connecticut, was traveling to Ohio to visit her sister and to find a husband. She was determined to marry a doctor or lawyer. By the time she had finally gotten to Ohio, she did not care who she married. She just didn't want to make the trip back to Connecticut. On November 5th, she and her party of travelers stopped at Jacob Palm's Tavern, the sign of the Grand Turk, 10 miles west of Carlisle on Route 11. It's the portion, the sign of the Grand Turk is the stone portion of the building. The wonderful barn is still there. Well, this is what she wrote in her journal. We came a little piece, as the Dutchmen say, and are in a most curious place tonight. If possible, I will describe it. It is a log hut built across the road from the tavern for the movers, and that's what they called people on their way west. That the landlord not be bothered with them. Had it been possible for our horses to have reached another inn, we would not have stayed with the Dutch cross, the old Dutch fellow. We have a good fire, a long dirty table, a few boards nailed up for a closet, 2 benches to sit on, 2 bottomless chairs, and a floor containing enough dirt to plant potatoes. We're going to sleep on the floor, all in the room together, in the old style. This is a photo of a bed in one of the taverns in Williamsburg. The snow-white linens on this bed are not an accurate representation of tavern bedding, according to the journals of many travelers. Mrs. Frances Trollope, who questioned the cleanliness of the bedding in her tavern, was assured that the linens on the bed had only been used for a few nights. An Englishman wrote, "Fortunate is the traveler who arrives on the day that the sheets happen to be changed," although an American would be quite indifferent about it. But American travelers were not indifferent, and they did what they could to pass the night. Margaret White noted that her pillowcase at one tavern looked like it had been on for 5 or 6 years. So she pinned her handkerchief over the pillow and put her nightgown on over her dress. Brother and sister Klug, Moravian missionaries, found that their tavern bedding had such an evil odor that they had to cover the pillows with their blankets in order not to inhale the smell. Even well-kept taverns, in even well-kept taverns, fleas and bed bugs were common and were the bane of many travelers. In 1811, Rouse Taylor wrote, "We retired to our lodgings when, lo, we found the beds most horrid and nasty, and bugs without number." This doesn't make you want to travel. Dr. Increase Matthews wrote in his journal, "Almost devoured by fleas last night. Got up in the night and lit a candle. After killing a number of fleas, tried to get a little repose. But little rest could I get, and it was more wearisome to lie in bed than travel over mountains and hills. Left the fleas and dirty bed as soon as daylight appeared." Well, obviously, not all taverns and their accommodations were the same. But cleanliness in these old taverns was a hard-fought battle. Fires for cooking and heating were lit all day, and the smoke from the fires and pipes clung to everything. Roads were unpaved, and mud and often manure were tracked in. And when windows were open in the warm weather, dust blew in from passing traffic. Mattresses were filled with, stuffed with chaff and feathers, and they absorbed odors. And laundering was a tedious process not done on a strict timetable. All that aside, as well as food, drink, and lodging for travelers, taverns serve the local population as a social and civic center. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, troops of actors and entertainers traveled from town to town where they played for a few nights in taverns that could accommodate a large crowd. Shakespeare's plays and the latest comedies were performed, and magicians astounded audiences with their feats. The advertisement on your left announces that on July 29, 1802, Mr. Rainey would appear in the ballroom of George Heigl on North Hanover Street in Carlisle, where he will exhibit his powers of ventriloquism and imitate all kinds of birds and beasts. And as a grand finale was his curious dialogue of an old landlord disturbed by a traveler. The performance, I've never forgotten this advertisement. It was put on in 1819 by a Frenchman who promised that he would create a thunderstorm whereby a tomb would be struck by lightning, and all of this would happen in Mr. Armour's Tavern on North Hanover Street. The newspaper item on your right announces that Mr. Pies would open a dancing assembly in Mr. Weekly's ballroom. And I have to say, many taverns had ballrooms, the larger taverns. It wasn't just in the towns, it was in the countryside also. On the second floor, the front of the building, for some of the taverns, there would be a board wall that was the wall for 2 rooms when it wasn't needed for a ballroom, and the wooden wall could be swung up and hooked to the ceiling to make one large room to use as a ballroom. Well, the dancing academy, dancing masters, just like performers, travel the circuit, and for a fee, they teach the men and women the latest dances because people were always interested in being fashionable. Dancing was a big social pastime, and after several weeks, they would have a ball so everyone could practice what they'd learned. Dancing, as I said, was a favorite social event. And in the winter, sleighing parties often brought their own fiddlers to play for them as they danced the night away. The winter also brought Washington's birthday and St. Patrick's Day, whose celebrations at the tavern involved dozens of toasts, which were usually published in the newspaper, and lots of alcoholic consumption. In addition to social centers, taverns served the residents of town and countryside in other ways. They occasionally served as medical centers. Excuse me. These are a little bit out of, as you can see by these teeth, which look more like a torture device, going to the dentist in a tavern was probably a smart idea. You could get a few drinks to calm your nerves before you saw the dentist, and then you could have a few more drinks to kill the pain afterwards. Traveling doctors came to taverns, and they promised to cure all manner of diseases, from cancer and gout to consumption and ulcers, which is probably why they only stayed in town for a week or so. Oops. In the spring, some taverns became horse breeding centers. The newspapers carried ads describing which horses would stand the season at whose taverns. This was a way that superior horse flesh could be introduced into the local stock. Tavern keepers made money by charging so much per leap, as it was known, as well as selling alcohol to the horses' owners. Public sales always drew a crowd, and tavern keepers sold a lot of alcohol on those days. This 1814 newspaper advertisement announced the public sale to be held at George Bauer's Tavern in Mechanicsburg, when a log house and lot, kitchen and stable were to be sold. Taverns were also the meeting places for county military units and brigades who were required by law to meet for training and drilling. The 1835 newspaper item on your left notifies members of the troop of the Cumberland Greens that they were to assemble at the Tavern of William Dimmick in South Middleton Township. The newspaper item on your right lists the results of an election of officers of the 1st Battalion of the 86th Regiment held at Frederick Wunderlich's Tavern in Mechanicsburg. So as you can see, the tavern was the social and civic center of the community, as well as a provider of food, lodging for travelers. But as we know, nothing lasts forever. Oh dear. Well, what you would have seen is a slide of a train. The coming of the railroads in the 1830s signaled the decline of the traditional old tavern. An historian writing in 1840 stated that the displacement of inns was abrupt. The opening of a railroad line could take most of the freight wagon, the stages, and private vehicles off of a given road almost overnight. The era of the hotel with its restaurant, its bar, and its private bedrooms were dawning. I've only skimmed the surface of tavern life in this presentation. 52 of the old taverns of Cumberland County are still standing. 2 of them operate as taverns, and the rest of them as private houses. Does anyone want to guess which 2 are still operating as taverns? Go ahead, Will.
Boiling Springs Tavern.
Right.
Mount Holly Inn.
You get 100% yes. As Lindsay said, we've revised and republished the tavern book that I did 25 years ago. And in these, you'll find the histories of each one of the taverns, the names of the tavern keepers, as well as their locations. Why not go and see them for yourselves? I think you will be surprised at some of the houses that you drive by all the time that were taverns. And if you want to visit 2 local historic taverns, the Frankenberger Tavern in Mechanicsburg is open on Saturdays from May through October, and the Dills Tavern Complex in Dillsburg is open every Sunday for tours from 2 to 4. Well, that's a bit about taverns. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for coming, and I'll take any questions if you have any. Okay, that's, yes.
What's the symbolism of the red lion?
I don't know, do you? No, I don't. Why a red lion? Obviously, it's British, but I'm sorry, I don't know.
And the follow-up then becomes for names that have, and I sort of would guess the same thing, maybe something to do with the British Empire.
Yes.
What happened with the Revolution, and how does a tavern keeper change the name of your tavern and pretend they didn't have something that was supporting the king in the...
Oh, well, and they did, because they had things like the sign of the king in Prussia and what have you before the Revolution. What I found is that tavern keepers moved around a lot, and I think almost the majority of tavern keepers rented rather than owned. So it was just paint another sign, change the name, paint a sign, or go to a new tavern and go to a different tavern and just keep that name. Yes?
Beyond the pictures of the one female sort of serving wine, or the alcohol, were there any female tavern owners?
Well, yes, but in all the research I did, and this book covered taverns from 1750 when the county was formed until the coming of the railroad in 1840, there might have been 6 or 7 women tavern keepers, and they were all the widows who kept maybe for a year or two. I think there was only one that you know, kept for maybe 15 years, and that was in Carlisle. But as you can imagine, there were problems with being a woman tavern keeper. Unwanted attention from some travelers, what were noted in journals. But again, it was hard work, and it was not something that you made a lot of money at. Yes?
Speaking of money, was there a standard currency that was used, or did they have currency from different states, or how did that work when you were traveling?
Well, that's a good question. Like what, traveling in Europe before the euro?
Well,
But
from
pounds,
state to state or town to town, before there was a standard currency.
well, obviously, they used the pound, shilling, and pence when we were still a colony. After that, I think by the 1790s, maybe, Lindsay, American currency, dollars and cents, was the standard.
So they did trade in paper money rather than just coins.
Yes, and again, you can see by the accounts, we're talking now of not travelers, but the locals who were a great deal of the business of a tavern keeper. When you see the tavern keeper's accounts, many, many people paid in kind. If they were a farmer, they'd give them oats. If they were a tailor, they'd make clothes for them. So, yes. And then, yes.
I have a question about the Mount Rock Tavern. I live near there, and so it looks a lot like that area where the 2 homes are, and there's a spring down in, and then Kurzville Road. Is that location? At least it looked like it in the picture.
Yes, that's the
Okay.
location. At some point when the turnpike was made, they straightened the road a bit.
Okay.
But that is the location, and the brick house that's there now is the second tavern.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, if you'd like to help yourself to a beer, maybe it's still there. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.